2015 was a huge year in pop culture. In film, we saw the release of The Big Short. In live theaters, the debut of the Broadway sensation Hamilton was taking place, and in TV, the final episode of Mad Men first aired. And meanwhile, over in the WWE, things were about to change forever with the rise of both NXT and a women's revolution. Of course, that wasn't all that was taking place this year. No, there was a lot more exciting stories that took place. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWE in 2015, a year in review. When we last left off, Brock Lesnar was the WWE World Heavyweight Champion, Seth Rollins was Mr. Money in the Bank, and the Authority were back in power. That said, any good times the heel group were feeling would be thrown into disarray when, in the weeks leading up to the show, Daniel Bryan returned to Raw to announce he was finally cleared to wrestle once more. Of course, given he'd announced this just in time for the Royal Rumble, many fans assumed it meant he'd be winning, then go on to challenge Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania. However, this idea was muddied by the fact that Roman Reigns was the new chosen one for Vince McMahon, and that there was equally as good of a chance he'd be winning the match. So heading into the Rumble on January 25th, this became the big question. But before we'd find out the answer to who WWE decided to go with, the undercard saw the Usos retain their tag team titles against The Miz and Damien Mizdow, and in one of the greatest triple threat matches ever, Brock Lesnar successfully defended the WWE World Heavyweight title against both John Cena and Seth Rollins. But for as excellent as this one was, it was the last thing people were thinking about come the end of the night, as, in the main event, after entering at number 10, Daniel Bryan would be eliminated mere minutes later. So, seeing the writing on the wall, many fans in attendance turned on the match for the second year running, and when Reigns won, the boos only got louder. Hell, even a surprise appearance from the big dog's cousin The Rock wasn't enough to get people on his side. No, understanding that their new hero was being chosen for them, one of the biggest examples of audiences turning on a performer would begin. And meanwhile, over on NXT, the show was continuing to thrive because on February 11th at Full Sail University, they held TakeOver Rival, a show which saw Finn Balor in full demon paint defeat Adrian Neville. The four horsewomen collide when Sasha Banks bested Charlotte Flair, Bayley, and Becky Lynch for the brand's women's title. And in the main event, Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens' years-long rivalry cross over to WWE when KO beat his best friend by technical knockout to win the NXT World title. Back on Raw and SmackDown, though, fans were still not taking to Roman Reigns in the lead-up to his WrestleMania showdown with Brock Lesnar. So it was then that he'd take on Daniel Bryan at February 22nd's Fastlane, with the hope here being that if he could take out the American Dragon cleanly, then hopefully fans would start to cheer for him. Of course, it wasn't enough though, and after the big dog scored the pinfall victory over Bryan, fans still booed him. That said, they did get plenty of things to cheer at this show, as it was the one which saw Rusev beat John Cena by technical submission, Goldust and Stardust get their long-awaited singles bout, and Sting show up again to challenge Triple H to a match at WrestleMania. But while this was a match no one thought they would ever see, it wasn't as much of a hell-freezing-over moment as what took place on March 28th when Randy Savage was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. Yes, after years of fan demand, the Macho Man finally got his due, and he wasn't alone in being inducted that year either, as the rest of the class was made up of names such as Kevin Nash, Rikishi, Alundra Blaze, and Larry Zbyszko. That said, the good atmosphere created by this would be fleeting, as the next night at WrestleMania 31, many fans were ready and waiting to boo Roman Reigns out of the building during the main event. Before we'd get there though, the undercard saw Damien Mizdow finally break free of the shackles of his boss The Miz during the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal, Daniel Bryan win the Intercontinental title in a ladder match which also included Dean Ambrose, Dolph Ziggler, Bad News Barrett, Stardust, Luke Harper, and R-Truth, and now babyface Randy Orton beat Seth Rollins by means of the greatest RKO of all time. Then, once that was done, Sting and Triple H finally went one-on-one. And while the match which followed was a great nostalgia trip which saw both the NWO and DX get involved, many people didn't like the ending, as Sting would lose his big WWE debut match. And after this, John Cena would defeat Rusev to start his iconic second reign with the United States title. And following from this, once AJ Lee gave her pay-per-view farewell to WWE by teaming with Paige to defeat the Bella Twins, and Ronda Rousey made a cameo appearance to help The Rock beat up The Authority, The Undertaker returned to face Bray Wyatt. And sure, with the streak now being over, a lot of the magic wasn't quite the same, but even taking this into consideration, it was great to see the Dead Man again as he scored another victory at the Showcase of the Immortals. What wasn't nice to see for many fans watching, though, was the main event where Roman Reigns was mercilessly booed as soon as he came through the curtain. That said, for as much as he was booed, he and Brock would shatter expectations by having an absolute 5-star classic here, one which was made all the better by the ending that saw Seth Rollins cash in his Money in the Bank contract to commit the heist of the century and win the WWE World Heavyweight title. Yes, realizing he couldn't end the show with Reigns winning, Vince McMahon had chosen to make a last-minute pivot. But while this would delight the live crowd, it upset many of the Anoa'i family who were backstage and who had come with the specific intention of seeing their boy get the victory. So, with tensions high, the next night on Raw was a predictably eventful one as it saw AJ Lee officially retire, Brock Lesnar get kayfabe suspended, and Daniel Bryan make one of his only Intercontinental title defenses. And the reason for the latter was because after suffering a concussion, the American Dragon was pulled from all upcoming events until a doctor could clear him again. Of course, this meant his planned IC title defense at April 26th Extreme Rules wouldn't take place then. No, instead that card saw other highlights such as the New Day winning the tag team titles from Cesaro and Tyson Kidd, John Cena and Rusev going at it again in a Russian chain match, and Seth Rollins making his first successful world title defense against Randy Orton inside of a steel cage. As for Roman Reigns, well, he'd win his last man standing bout against the Big Show, but it wouldn't be enough to get him cheered. And he wouldn't get cheered at May 17th's Payback either, where he went against Seth Rollins, Dean Ambrose, and Randy Orton in a fatal 4-way match for the WWE World Heavyweight title. So thankfully for fans then, he didn't win this one. No, that honor went to the Architect instead as he continued his reign on top. Elsewhere on the card, meanwhile, the rest of the show would be made up of such highlights as the now fully called up Neville getting a win over Wade Barrett and John Cena beating Rusev again in an I Quit match to end their feud. But this wasn't the end of Big Match John's US title run though, because both before and after his final showdown with the Bulgarian Brute, he'd be hosting an open challenge on Raw every week. And this allowed him to put on some of his best performances ever, as in a late career revival, he'd shine against the likes of Cesaro, Dean Ambrose, and Sami Zayn. That said, his biggest challenge to date wouldn't come until the May 18th episode of Raw, as it was then NXT World Champion Kevin Owens invaded the main roster and began the build to a match between the two. Before that happened though, KO would have to defend his title against Sami Zayn at TakeOver Unstoppable on May 20th, and while he would retain here, it was only after things went to a no contest once it became clear a shoulder injury meant Sami could no longer compete. But that wasn't the only notable moment of the Black and Gold brand's time in the spotlight here, as elsewhere, Sasha Banks successfully defended her women's title against Becky Lynch, and Finn Balor scored a victory over Tyler Breeze. Of course, for as critically acclaimed as this show was, however, it would be pushed to the back of fans' minds just 11 days later then, as in Corpus Christi, Texas, Elimination Chamber took place. And while there was plenty of note happening here, such as Dean Ambrose beating Seth Rollins by disqualification and Ryback winning the now vacant Intercontinental title after Daniel Bryan's ongoing injury status forced him to relinquish it, the real story was that in one of the greatest called shots ever, Kevin Owens pinned John Cena clean in the middle of the ring in a non-title bout. So heading into Money in the Bank on June 14th then, KO felt confident he could do the same again. Unfortunately for him though, when the time for the rematch came that night, he'd end up losing after finding himself on the receiving end of 3 attitude adjustments. Elsewhere on the show, meanwhile, Seth Rollins managed to beat Dean Ambrose when the two faced off in a ladder match for the WWE World Heavyweight title. Sheamus won a Money in the Bank ladder match, which also included Dolph Ziggler, Kane, Kofi Kingston, Neville, Randy Orton, and Roman Reigns, and Nikki Bella successfully defended her Divas title against Paige. That said, so little attention had been given to the latter feud, and the women's division in general, that many fans were now starting to ask for the women to get more time. So, hoping to address these fans, on the July 13th episode of Raw, just 9 days after WWE held a show in Tokyo, Japan entitled The Beast in the East, which saw Finn Balor beat Kevin Owens for the NXT World title, Stephanie McMahon came out to the ring and announced the call-up of Charlotte Flair, Sasha Banks, and Becky Lynch. Yes, in what was being called the Divas Revolution, the plan was now to give more focus to the women on the show, as had been done on NXT for some time. And this would carry into July 19th's Battleground, as there, Charlotte defeated Sasha Banks and Brie Bella in a triple threat match. But this wasn't all that was happening here, because elsewhere, Bray Wyatt and Roman Reigns went one-on-one, John Cena got another victory over Kevin Owens in their rubber match for the US title, and in the main event, Seth Rollins managed to leave his bout against a returning Brock Lesnar, still the champion, after The Undertaker made a shock return and cost Brock the belt. Needless to say then, Lesnar wanted revenge, and this would lead to the rematch of the century at SummerSlam just 1 month later. Before we get there though, NXT had another big show when, on August 22nd, they took to the road for the first time and held TakeOver Brooklyn inside of a sold-out Barclays Center. And there, while the likes of Finn Balor defeating Kevin Owens in a ladder match for the NXT World title, and Jushin Thunder Liger making his lone WWE appearance to take on Tyler Breeze were certainly highlights, the real show-stealing moment came when Sasha Banks and Bayley had arguably the greatest women's match ever, a match which ended with Bayley finally winning the women's title. That's right, it was a breakthrough moment for the women and a sign of what was to come. And it also meant that SummerSlam the following night had big shoes to fill, as it had to live up to such an excellent show. Luckily though, for the most part, this one was pretty good as it featured the likes of Dean Ambrose and Roman Reigns defeating the Wyatt family in a tag team match, Kevin Owens getting the victory over Cesaro, Neville teaming with Arrow star Stephen Amell to beat Stardust and Wade Barrett, and Daily Show host Jon Stewart turning heel when he cost John Cena a win over Seth Rollins. Of course, this meant then that not only would the Architect walk out of the show WWE World Heavyweight Champion, but he'd also be United States Champion too. That said, even this achievement couldn't earn him the main event spot, as that was taken up by Brock Lesnar versus The Undertaker round 2. And here, while the match was mostly great, it was hampered by a questionable ending, which saw the referee miss the dead man tapping out while caught in a Kimura lock. So when he kicked the Beast in the Family Jewels moments later and got the win, the ending felt a little anticlimactic. And that was why a rubber match was assumed to be coming in the near future, but it wouldn't come at September 20th's Night of Champions though. No, on that night, the big match on the card outside of possibly Charlotte defeating Nikki Bella to win the Divas Championship was Sting returning to challenge Seth Rollins for the WWE World Heavyweight title. And this wasn't the only match the Architect had here because, as the reigning US champion too, he'd have to defend that belt against John Cena. But even if he lost to Big Match John, he was still at least able to retain against Sting, although that victory came with a sense of bitterness as, during the world title match, the Icon picked up an injury which ended his in-ring career with WWE for good. Not that Steve Borden held any grudges against Rollins for this though, as he understood it was just one of those accidents which sometimes happen when you're in the ring. And the WWE didn't hold it against the champ either, as following another WWE Network special at Madison Square Garden on October 3rd, where he took on John Cena once more, Seth prepared himself to head into Hell in a Cell, still the top guy in WWE. Before that happened though, NXT held another banger when on October 7th at TakeOver Respect, Finn Balor and Samoa Joe defeated Baron Corbin and Rhino to win the first annual Dusty Rhodes Tag Team Classic. On top of that, not only would Asuka make an early impact with a win over Dana Brooke, but for the first time in history, a WWE-produced show ended with the women going on last when Sasha Banks and Bayley went 30 minutes in an Iron Woman match. Of course, given the fact that Sasha was now on the main roster, it only made sense the Hugger would win here to retain her women's title. And after it was over, Charlotte Flair and Becky Lynch came out to celebrate with them, as NXT said goodbye for the most part to the era of the Four Horsewomen. But the Black and Gold brand's loss was the main roster's gain as it turned out because, at Hell in a Cell on October 25th, Charlotte Flair went one-on-one with Nikki Bella again for the Divas title, and after submitting her opponent, would be able to retain here. And she wasn't the only champion retaining. No, elsewhere the New Day defeated the recently returned Dudley Boys to keep the tag team titles around their waists. Kevin Owens got the better of Ryback in order to take the Intercontinental title back home with him, and Seth Rollins survived an onslaught from Kane in the WWE World Heavyweight title match. As for John Cena though, well, he wouldn't be so lucky because after laying out another open challenge for his United States title, he'd be surprised by returning Alberto Del Rio, with this ultimately putting him off his guard enough to the point that he dropped the belt to the Mexican star here. Of course, the real story of this show was neither of those bouts. No, the real story was the main event where inside Hell in a Cell, Brock Lesnar and The Undertaker finally settled things once and for all in what may very well have been the Dead Man's last great in-ring encounter. But while he certainly put up a battle worthy of his legacy here, it was the Beast who was standing tall once all was said and done, and the Phenom who was left to be carried away by the Wyatt family. So when he found out his brother had also been a victim of Bray Wyatt and his crew then, Kane stepped up to offer him some backup over the weeks which followed, and this would lead to a tag team match at November 22nd Survivor Series, which saw the Brothers of Destruction reunite to defeat Bray Wyatt and Luke Harper. Elsewhere though, plans would be far more in flux, as after Seth Rollins injured his knee at a live event in Dublin, Ireland on November 4th, he was forced to vacate the WWE World Heavyweight title. So this meant, just like with Deadly Games 17 years ago, a one-night tournament would be held to crown a new champ. Still alive in the semifinals of the tournament as the show went to air would be none other than Roman Reigns, Alberto Del Rio, Dean Ambrose, and Kevin Owens. That said, after Del Rio and Owens were eliminated early on in the night, it left just the 2 former Shield members left. So, while they were preparing for the main event, fans took a breather to watch on as the rest of the card saw Charlotte Flair defeat Paige to retain her Divas title. Then, once that was over, Reigns and Ambrose hit the ring for a bout which remained friendly between them despite what was on the line. Of course, fans weren't so jovial when it came to the big dog though, because pretty early on, they made it clear exactly who they wanted to see come out the victor. So when Roman won just after 9 minutes to start his first reign on top, many fans were not pleased. That was until Sheamus came down to the ring to cash in his Money in the Bank contract and steal the title away at the last minute. Yes, in a way to create sympathy for the babyface Reigns here, the title had been put on Sheamus and have him create a new heel stable around him in the form of the League of Nations. And this would lead to another showdown between the champ and his challenger at TLC Tables, Ladders, and Chairs on December 13th then, with things here being contested in a TLC match. Before that main event came around though, the undercard would have some notable moments too, as it featured Dean Ambrose defeating Kevin Owens to win the Intercontinental title, and the New Day successfully defending their tag team titles against the Usos and the Lucha Dragons in a triple threat tag team ladder match. Of course, once these bouts were over though, the focus was all on whether the big dog could overcome Sheamus. And by the end, Roman would be screwed out of the victory, after which he would lay out Triple H with a Superman punch. And this led to the traditional wrestler versus the authority angle when Vince McMahon himself got involved the next night on Raw, offering Roman a rematch but only under the condition that he act as the crooked special guest referee. In the end though, even if the boss was heavily biased towards the Irishman in this one, Reigns was able to get the win come the close in order to start his second run with the top title, and this time, he'd finally get cheered in doing so. Yes, it felt like WWE had turned a corner on their fans' relationship to their next top star. But that still wasn't the end of the year for them because, after another tribute to the Troops show, NXT headed over to the UK to put on TakeOver London, a show where not only did the Revival solidify their recent tag team title victory with a win over Enzo Amore and Big Cass, but Bayley and Finn Balor would both retain their women's and world titles against Nia Jax and Samoa Joe, respectively. Yes, what a transformative year 2015 was. By this point, in fact, you could see that WWE were now fully into the modern era, as with a whole crop of younger stars taking the reins, the PG era days seemed to be a thing of the past.